welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story echoes in the quarry. The quarry was a lonely place. Just a mile away from the nearest town, it had been abandoned for years after the company went bankrupt. The rusting skeletons of machinery and crumbling concrete walls were all that remained of the bustling operation. Now, it was just me, the night shift guard, and the ever-present sound of wind scraping through the metal structures. I had been assigned to the site as part of a fly-in, fly-out arrangement. I worked 12-hour night shifts and was tasked with ensuring that no one trespassed or tampered with the derelict equipment. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd walk the grounds, inspect the buildings, check the fences, and occasionally inspect the old office block where the company's headquarters had once been. The air was heavy with dust, and the silence was thick enough to feel like it was pressing down on me. But even then, there was something unnerving about the place. The quarry had always been a symbol of hard labor, long hours, and dangerous work. There had been rumors that some workers had disappeared during the final days of production, but that wasn't something I wanted to dwell on. I had worked similar jobs in isolated locations before, but this was different. There was a stillness in the air here, an absence that settled deep into your bones. I shrugged it off as a natural reaction to being alone in a desolate place. But one night, as I was completing my rounds, things took a strange turn. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed something unusual. From my post by the guard shack, I could see the old administration building through the chain-link fence. The building was dark, with a few broken windows and boarded-up doors, but tonight, the lights were flickering on and off in a rhythmic pattern. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the faulty wiring from the storm the night before. But the flickering grew more consistent, and something inside me told me to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the building. As I walked past the rusting equipment and the half-collapsed storage containers, a feeling of unease started creeping up my spine. I could hear my own footsteps echoing across the empty ground, and the sound only seemed to amplify as I neared the building. The wind had picked up, howling through the skeletal remains of the quarry. When I reached the administration building, I stood outside for a moment, just staring at the flickering lights. The building seemed lifeless, yet something about it felt off. The windows looked black, as though someone had placed a dark sheet over them, but the light coming from the inside wasn't normal. It was erratic, pulsing in a way that reminded me of the heartbeat of a dying animal. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was cold. Not just the typical chill of an abandoned building, but something deeper. As I shone my flashlight around, I could see that the dust had settled over everything, undisturbed for years. The once organized desks were now covered in piles of yellowed paper and forgotten files. But what caught my attention was the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing through the halls. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. No one should have been here. No one had worked here in over a decade. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was just the wind, I told myself. Maybe it was the way the air flowed through the building, causing the floorboards to creak. But the footsteps came again, this time closer. They weren't like the random noises you hear in an empty building, they were deliberate, as though someone was walking toward me. I felt my hands tremble, but I forced myself to move forward. I crept down the hallway, following the sounds. As I passed the old offices, the lights flickered again, and I saw a shadow dart past one of the windows. My breath caught in my throat. It was just a trick of the light. It had to be. But then I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, and indistinct. Help me. It came from the far end of the hall, beyond the manager's office, where the building seemed to dip into total darkness. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I didn't. I felt compelled to investigate, driven by a curiosity I couldn't explain. I pushed forward, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. As I neared the end of the hall, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, forming a cloud of mist in the air. The voice came again, louder this time. Help me, before it's too late. I reached the doorway and paused, heart pounding in my chest. The door was ajar, and through the crack, I could see something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the middle of the room, bathed in the flickering light. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted expression. He was wearing an old, worn uniform, one that looked out of place in a building that had been abandoned for years. But the most disturbing part was his mouth, which hung open in a grotesque, silent scream. Before I could move, the figure turned to face me, its eyes locking onto mine. I felt the room grow colder still, the temperature plunging to an almost unbearable degree. Get out, a voice whispered in my ear. It wasn't the figure, it was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere. I turned and fled. I didn't stop running until I reached the gatehouse, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I locked the door behind me, pressing my back against the cold metal, trying to calm my racing heart. The figure was still in my mind, its eyes haunting me, its twisted mouth still frozen in that silent scream. I didn't know what happened in that building, but I knew I wasn't going back inside. The rest of my shift was a blur of unease. The lights continued to flicker in the administration building, but I couldn't bring myself to go back there. I spent the rest of the night staring at the monitor in the gatehouse, constantly checking the security feeds, but there was nothing unusual on the cameras. The next night, I had a new shift partner, someone who had been transferred from another site. He was a big guy, not easily frightened, but when I told him what happened, he went pale. You saw him? He asked, his voice shaking. I nodded. Yeah, I did. Did you hear the story about the old manager? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. No. What story? He leaned in closer. There was an old manager who worked here before everything went bad. He was a real bastard. He'd make workers stay for hours after their shift ended, forcing them to do extra work. There were rumors he was involved in some shady business too. One night, he was found in that building, just like you saw. He died, right there in that room, but not from any natural cause. Some say he was cursed. I didn't say anything. The fear that had gripped me the night before had returned, and I could feel the weight of it settling on my chest. From that night on, things only got worse. The figure would appear on occasion, always in the same spot, always staring at me with those empty eyes. And sometimes, I'd hear whispers in the wind, calling my name. Eventually, the company closed the quarry for good. They never offered any explanation. They just packed up, leaving the place to fall into further ruin. But I'll never forget that night. The night I saw the figure in the old manager's office. The Night I realized that some things never truly leave. Some things haunt the places they once occupied, waiting for the next person to walk through the door. And when that person does, they'll be there, watching. Story: The warehouse on Oak Ridge Road. It was one of those jobs that didn't seem special at first. A security guard for a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The kind of place people don't visit unless they need to. The warehouse on Oak Ridge Road had long since been abandoned, or so it seemed. There were rumors, of course, there always are, but for Jake McAllister, it was just another gig. The pay was decent, and the hours, though long, allowed him to be alone with his thoughts. It was a quiet life, and for Jake, that was all that mattered. Jake had been working the night shift for 3 weeks now, ever since the security company had picked him up. The place was supposed to be empty, the kind of location where nothing happened after dark. The owner had long since moved to a new property, and the warehouse stood like an uninviting monolith at the edge of town, its rusted metal walls reflecting the harsh light of the nearby street lamps. The first night Jake arrived, he noticed something odd. No other cars were parked outside. No workers, no other security personnel, not even a night shift cleaning crew. Just him and the wide, empty parking lot. He didn't think much of it at the time. There was something strange about the place, something that seemed out of place, but he brushed it off. He had grown used to working odd jobs in the past, some of which were far less pleasant than this. But it didn't take long before the oddities started. Jake had been working the night shift for 2 days before the first real weirdness happened. It was around 2:30 a.m. when he took a walk around the property, something he did to stretch his legs after sitting in the security office for hours. The warehouse was an old, sprawling complex, with rows upon rows of shelving that reached up toward the ceiling, filled with outdated equipment, old boxes, and industrial-sized storage containers. Jake's flashlight flickered as he walked past one of the aisles, and he froze, the beam of light catching something just ahead. A man. He was standing in the middle of the aisle, about 20 feet away, wearing a faded blue jumpsuit and a baseball cap. His back was to Jake, and he didn't move. For a moment, Jake thought he was just one of the old employees, someone who hadn't left. But when he called out to the man, there was no response. He called again, stepping closer. "Hey, are you okay?" Still no answer. When Jake stepped forward, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, the man turned his head slightly, but not enough to meet Jake's eyes. His face was pale, and his lips were blue, like he was cold or sick. His eyes, hidden behind the cap's brim, seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, but not with any color Jake could recognize. They just shimmered unnaturally. "Are you all right?" Jake asked, now a bit uneasy. The man didn't speak, but he slowly lifted his hand, pointing toward the back of the warehouse. It was then that Jake noticed something strange. The man's fingers were thin, almost skeletal, and as he pointed, his hand trembled violently. Jake blinked and looked away for just a split second, but when he looked back, the man was gone. Vanished. No footsteps. No sounds. Just gone. Jake spent the rest of that night trying to make sense of what he'd seen, but no answers came. The next day, he reported the incident to his supervisor, who shrugged it off. "Old place. McAllister. You're seeing things. Just keep to your rounds. It's a simple job. Nothing happens around here." Jake didn't press the issue. After all, he needed the paycheck. But that night, something felt different. The warehouse seemed darker, quieter. As he walked past the rows of shelves, he noticed that the doors to the storage rooms, those that were supposed to be locked, were slightly ajar, just wide enough for him to hear something faint on the other side. A scratching sound. It was a subtle noise, like something, or someone, was moving behind the door. Jake couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to open the door or call it in. But when he grabbed the door handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. He could feel the cool metal against his hand, but it didn't give. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He backed away slowly, but the scratching continued. Louder now, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Jake's instincts screamed at him to leave, but he stayed. He had a job to do. The real trouble started the next night. It was around 3 a.m., and Jake had finished his rounds and was sitting in the security office, trying to stay awake with a cup of coffee. His eyes kept drifting to the monitors, though he wasn't expecting much. This was a quiet, almost abandoned place. There was no reason to worry. Then, the alarm system went off. A single blaring beep. Jake jumped out of his seat and rushed to the screen. It was coming from the far end of the warehouse. The section where they stored the old, unused coffins. Coffins. He didn't know why they had so many. The warehouse was just supposed to be a storage facility for miscellaneous equipment, yet there were rows of wooden coffins, all stacked high and wrapped in dusty plastic. He'd never given it much thought before, but now, with the alarm blaring and the silence hanging heavy in the air, it felt like a bad omen. He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the storage section. As he moved past the shelves, the lights overhead flickered, and the temperature dropped. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. At the far end of the aisle, there was movement. A coffin lid had shifted. Jake stopped dead in his tracks. The lid was slowly moving off, inch by inch, as if something inside was pushing against it. He froze. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he trained the beam on the coffin. The lid continued to shift, until it fell off the side of the coffin and crashed to the ground with a loud thud. There was nothing inside. Jake's mind raced. Had someone been playing a prank on him? A worker hiding inside? He felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. But as he moved forward, he noticed something even stranger. All the coffins had been disturbed. The lids weren't sealed properly. They were all ajar, just like the doors from earlier. But there was nothing inside them. Just empty coffins. Get a grip, Jake, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the mounting sense of dread. He had to finish his rounds. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. Help me. Jake didn't return for the next shift. He called in sick and spent the day in his apartment, too terrified to go back. His mind was plagued with the thought of the coffins, those empty, haunted coffins, and the unsettling voice that echoed in the darkness. But that night, his phone rang. It was his supervisor. "You're not gonna believe this, McAllister. We just got a call from the owner of the warehouse. He wants to meet with you. Apparently, there's been some issue with the security footage." Footage? What are you talking about? The footage from last night. There's something on it. And we need you to come back in. Just come in and talk to him, all right? Reluctantly, Jake agreed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And something in the pit of his stomach told him that the answers he was looking for were waiting for him back at that warehouse. Jake walked into the warehouse one last time. His supervisor greeted him at the door, but there was a strange tension in the air. The entire building was dark, silent, as if it had been abandoned once again. "Come on," the supervisor said, leading him to the security room. When they played the footage, Jake's blood ran cold. There, on the screen, was Jake from the previous night, walking toward the coffins, shining his flashlight. But in the corner of the footage, just beyond the frame, there was a figure, a shadow, a silhouette of a man, standing just outside the camera's view. The man in the jumpsuit. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the figure moved, stepping into the light. But it wasn't a man at all. It was a corpse. A hollowed-out, decaying figure, with skin as thin as paper and eyes that gleamed like twin orbs of cold fire. And as Jake stared in horror, the figure's lips parted. It spoke. "You shouldn't have stayed, McAllister." Story: The Night Watcher. For years, I worked as a night shift security guard for a large industrial complex on the outskirts of town. The factory had been operational for decades, producing automotive parts in the 1950s and 60s, but by the time I was hired, its purpose had shifted. The plant had become a storage facility, holding unused machinery, old inventory, and boxes upon boxes of obsolete parts. It was a place steeped in the kind of quiet, mechanical inertia that only comes with time, and I quickly grew accustomed to the stillness of the place. The company was small, privately owned, and with the advent of budget cuts, they ran on a skeleton crew. There were about 5 of us working at night, 2 night security guards, a janitor, a foreman, and the occasional technician who was on call. My job, like everyone else's, was straightforward. I spent most of my shift wandering through the empty, silent halls, ensuring the doors were locked and the premises remained secure. The factory floor, with its towering machines and rusting equipment, was both eerie and strangely comforting. I felt like a part of its mechanical rhythm, existing in the long hours between dusk and dawn. It was late fall when the changes began, the air thick with the smell of damp leaves and the scent of wet concrete. A chill had settled over the factory, making my breath visible in the flickering lights of the main hall. My night shift always began at midnight and ended at 8 a.m., but this time something felt different. A creeping unease settled over me. I couldn't quite place it, but it was as if the factory itself was holding its breath. One particular night, I was assigned to a different building, one of the older structures that hadn't been used in years. The building had been repurposed as storage for parts that were no longer useful, stacked high in rows of wooden crates. My task was simple: walk through the halls, check the windows and doors, and make sure everything was in place. The first hour passed uneventfully, the dull hum of the fluorescent lights overhead providing a faint, rhythmic background noise. I made my rounds, passing through aisles of crates, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the concrete floors. It wasn't until the second hour that I began to notice the strange occurrences. At first, it was subtle. A noise in the distance. A faint scraping sound. I paused and turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the empty aisles of crates stretching into the darkness. I shook it off, telling myself that it was just the wind outside or the building settling. I continued walking, the sensation of being watched slowly creeping up my spine. Then, the noise came again, this time louder. It was unmistakable. The distinct sound of Something dragging across the floor, followed by a soft thud. I froze, my heart racing. The factory was supposed to be empty. I glanced around, but all I could see were the shadows cast by the dim lighting. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, but the beam of light only revealed rows upon rows of crates. Nothing. I was about to dismiss it as my imagination when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, a man, or something that resembled one, stood at the end of the aisle, just beyond the reach of the light. He was tall and hunched, his outline barely visible against the darkness. I couldn't see his face, but something about him felt wrong. It wasn't just the fact that he was standing in a place where no one should be. It was the way he stood, unnaturally still, as if he were waiting for something. For me. I called out, my voice louder than I intended, "Hey, who's there?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, he began to move, slowly, deliberately, towards me. His footsteps were heavy, dragging across the floor like the sound I had heard earlier. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. I backed into the corner, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a prank, some kind of joke. I had heard rumors about this building being haunted, but I had never believed in such things. There was a logical explanation for everything. But as the figure drew closer, I began to question my reasoning. The man, or whatever it was, continued moving, his heavy footsteps growing louder with each step. I was paralyzed, unable to move. The air seemed to grow colder, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. My heartbeat was loud in my ears as I finally managed to speak again. This time more urgently. "Who are you? What do you want?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a flashlight of his own, clicking it on. The light illuminated his face for the first time. What I saw made my stomach drop. His face was pale, almost sickly looking, with hollow eyes that seemed too large for his face. His skin had an odd, waxy quality to it, and his mouth, when he opened it to speak, was unnaturally wide, stretching too far for a normal human to manage. His lips were cracked and dry, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "Help me," he said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. The sound of his voice was enough to break the spell that had gripped me. I turned on my heel and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and labored, as though he were dragging something across the floor. I didn't stop running until I reached the front doors of the building, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I rushed to the security office, locking the door behind me and breathing heavily. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number of my supervisor. When he picked up, I explained what had happened, but he sounded skeptical. He assured me that there were no reports of any unusual activity and advised me to finish my shift. But I couldn't go back. Not after what I had seen. I requested that someone else come in to cover my shift, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, he agreed. I left the factory that night, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange man I had seen. Had he been real? Was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure, would never set foot in that building again. The weeks that followed were a blur. I tried to put the incident out of my mind, but it lingered. The haunting image of the man's face, the distorted, twisted expression he had worn, would pop into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. I even started having dreams about him, nightmares in which he would appear in the shadows, waiting for me, dragging his feet across the floor. Months passed, and I was transferred to a different part of the facility, far away from the building where I had seen the man. It was a relief, but the unease never fully left. Every time I walked past that section of the complex, I would feel a sense of dread wash over me, like someone, or something, was watching me. And then, one night, while doing my rounds, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow. A figure. Standing in the same place I had seen the man that fateful night. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't believe it. There, just beyond the reach of the light, was the same figure I had seen months ago. But this time, he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, waiting. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get out of the building and never look back. But I had a job to do, and I wasn't going to let fear control me. I approached cautiously, my flashlight shaking in my hand. And when the light hit him, I saw that he was still there, his face pale and twisted, just as it had been before. But this time, he didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me. And then I understood. He wasn't a man. He was something else. Something I couldn't explain. Something that had been waiting for me all along. Story: The Forgotten Warehouse. It was late November when I first heard about the warehouse. My security company had recently taken on a new client, a sprawling industrial complex just outside of Denver, Colorado. The place had a long history, one that stretched back more than 50 years. The buildings had been used for everything from manufacturing to storage, and as time went on, they became more and more isolated. Despite the growing number of empty units, the warehouse at the far end of the property had always been off-limits. The company had written it off as too old to be useful, and over time, it simply became a relic, a forgotten part of the complex. My job was simple enough: patrol the area, keep an eye on the security cameras, and make sure nobody tried to break in. I had worked night shifts before, so the idea of spending 12 hours alone in a dimly lit guard shack didn't faze me. What did start to get under my skin, however, was the feeling of being watched. It started small, as these things often do. One night, during my usual patrol, I noticed the faint flicker of light coming from the corner of the complex. It was coming from the warehouse. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, maybe some reflection from the street lamps outside, but it kept happening. Every few minutes, I would spot a faint glow, just enough to catch my eye. When I checked the cameras, however, the warehouse was always empty. On the third night of my shift, I decided to investigate. I didn't have permission to enter the warehouse, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt I needed to check. Maybe the wiring was faulty, or maybe there was something I was missing. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the far end of the property. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the usual sounds of city life seemed far away. The warehouse loomed ahead, its shadow stretching across the empty parking lot. When I got closer, I noticed something odd. The large steel doors, which were always sealed shut, were slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen anyone around, and there hadn't been any reports of intruders. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open with a creak. It was dark inside, the air heavy with dust and the smell of old wood and metal. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The warehouse was enormous, filled with rows of abandoned shelves and piles of forgotten equipment. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As I walked deeper into the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft shuffle of my boots on the concrete floor. Then, I heard it. A faint scraping noise, like something, or someone, was moving in the dark. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening intently. It came again, closer this time. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I slowly turned around, scanning the shadows. There was nothing there. I felt ridiculous. It was probably just the wind, or the building settling. But still, something didn't sit right with me. I walked deeper into the warehouse, determined to find the source of the noise. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The temperature seemed to drop, and I noticed a chill running down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as the cold, but it felt different. Colder, more unnatural. As I passed an old set of shelves stacked with metal crates, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but again, there was nothing there. The air was still. Too still. Then, I heard it again, a soft whisper, like the sound of someone speaking just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the vibrations in the air. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. There was something compelling me to stay, to find the source of the noise, to uncover whatever secrets the warehouse held. I followed the whisper, stepping cautiously around boxes and piles of debris. My flashlight illuminated a narrow hallway that led deeper into the warehouse. As I walked, the whisper grew louder, almost as if it was calling my name. I stopped at the entrance to the hallway, my breath catching in my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, deep down, that whatever was waiting for me in that hallway was something I wasn't meant to find. But still, I stepped forward. The hallway was lined with old doors, some open, some closed. I moved down the corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick with dust, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. My flashlight flickered again, and then, suddenly, it went out. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to replace the batteries. But as I struggled in the dark, I heard the sound again. This time, it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. I felt a sudden wave of dread wash over me. I had to leave. Now. I spun around, my hands shaking as I tried to open the door behind me. But the door was stuck. I pulled harder, desperate to escape. And then, just as I thought I was going to break the door down, it opened with a soft creak. I rushed outside, back into the main area of the warehouse. But as I stepped into the light, I saw something that froze my blood. Standing at the far end of the warehouse, just beyond the entrance, was a figure. It was tall. Almost 7 feet, and it stood completely still, watching me with piercing eyes. There was no expression on its face, just an empty, hollow gaze. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if it was distorting the space itself. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. And then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows. I stood there, frozen in fear, unsure of what I had just seen. The figure wasn't human. It wasn't even real, at least not in the way I understood. It was something else, something ancient. And it wasn't just a random apparition. It was waiting for me. Story: The Watcher in the Warehouse. The town of Clayton Falls had always been quiet, almost unnervingly so. Nestled between two mountain ranges, it felt like the kind of place time forgot, a place where old buildings stood forgotten, waiting for the world to catch up. It was the kind of town where things didn't change, where life went on in a steady rhythm of routine and predictability. For most, it was a haven of peace; for others, it was a reminder of how easily you could become irrelevant in a fast-moving world. Jenna Collins, 22 years old, was a fresh face in town. She had moved from the city, seeking respite from the pressures of her previous life, hoping the serenity of Clayton Falls would give her the clarity she needed. She had just started working as a night security officer at a local warehouse, the kind of job that didn't ask too much of her, a perfect fit for her need to escape from everything. It was quiet work, the kind where you patrolled the property, checked cameras, and ensured that no one was trespassing or up to no good. At least, that was plan. The warehouse itself was massive, a hulking, industrial structure that once belonged to a large shipping company. The building was mostly abandoned now, except for a few storage units that were still used by local businesses. Most of the time, there was nothing to do but sit in the small security booth near the front entrance, sipping coffee and passing the time. Jenna had been working the night shift for 2 weeks, and so far, there hadn't been a single incident. She was getting comfortable in her role, but there was something about the warehouse that always left her with an unsettled feeling. It wasn't the building itself, no, it was something more intangible. The silence. The way the air seemed thicker in the warehouse at night, as if the building had a presence of its own. Sometimes, when she walked through the aisles between the long rows of storage units, it felt as if the walls were watching her. That night, Jenna was working her usual routine. She'd completed the first round of her patrol, checking the exterior and the main loading dock area, then moved inside the building to check the inner storage sections. Everything was quiet, just the hum of the overhead lights and the sound of her footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. As she made her way through the storage aisles, she came across a strange door at the far end of the building. She had seen it before, of course, it was part of her usual rounds. But tonight, something was different. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint flickering light shone through the crack. Jenna paused, her heart rate quickening. It was strange. She was the only one on shift that night, and the door was supposed to be locked. In the past, she had always made sure everything was secured before beginning her rounds. Why was this door open? She approached cautiously, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the floor. The closer she got, the more she felt something tugging at her instinct, urging her to turn back. But curiosity got the better of her. When she reached the door, she peered inside. The room was dimly lit by an old overhead lamp, its light flickering sporadically. The walls were lined with old boxes and discarded furniture, nothing out of the ordinary. But as she stepped into the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the air was colder here than anywhere else in the warehouse, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. "Hello?" Jenna called, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. No response. She stepped further into the room, her eyes scanning the shelves and corners. As she moved deeper into the space, her flashlight caught something strange. In the far corner, partially obscured by an old filing cabinet, was a chair. It looked out of place, old, wooden, and worn down by time. What struck her as odd was the fact that it was facing the wall, almost as if someone had placed it there deliberately, as though they wanted to hide. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to leave the room but froze mid-step. The light flickered again, and the chair, which had been facing the wall, now seemed to be turned just slightly toward her. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how it had happened, but the chair had moved. Suddenly, the overhead lamp above her went out completely, leaving her in darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she turned it back on. The beam of light flickered for a second but then steadied. She turned to exit the room, but her footsteps faltered. When she heard it, the soft sound of breathing. It wasn't loud. It was almost imperceptible, like someone was standing just behind her. Jenna whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there. She stepped back, panic rising in her throat. The door was still open behind her, and the only sound in the room was her own breathing. She didn't know why, but she had the overwhelming sense that something, or someone, was in the room with her. It felt as though the walls were closing in, as if the very air was becoming denser, more oppressive. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the door. As she reached the doorway, she glanced back one last time. That's when she saw it, a figure, standing just outside the reach of her flashlight beam. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and a misshapen silhouette. Its face was obscured by shadows, but Jenna could feel its gaze burning into her. The door slammed shut behind her as she exited, and she didn't stop running until she reached the front of the warehouse. She burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Her heart still racing. Jenna didn't return to the building that night. She called her supervisor, telling them that she had felt uneasy and that she was going home. But deep down, she knew she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her. Something was inside that warehouse, and it wasn't human. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.